Hello, Jeff Zwaring here. Welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific issues and help you be more confident in the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Fazale Rana, and we're going to look at the topic of cruelty in nature and ask the question, is it really evil? Fuzz, it's good to have you here today.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Look forward to our topic today because this is one of those where skeptics and people who are puzzled or troubled by Christianity often push and say, there's just a lot of things about the way this world works that doesn't fit with a good God. Things are cruel. There are animals that are brutal. So talking about this cruelty, when you think of cruelty, how are you talking about that? What are some of the examples of that?
Yeah, well, and to your point, when you look at nature, particularly when you look at the animals found in nature, there's incredible power and majesty that for many people reflect the Creator's handiwork. But there's also this element of brutality and cruelty that you see in nature that seems to undermine the idea of God's goodness. And for many people, that's a reason to even reject God's existence.
Mhm.
And so, it's not only is nature red in tooth and claw, but there are features in nature that are really deeply troubling. One of them is cannibalism, where you actually have animals cannibalizing their offspring. They will abandon their young, or in some instances, they will actually cannibalize their young. And that just, really begs the question, why would God create a world where animals abandon their young, where animals actually engage in cannibalism against their own offspring?
Yeah, that seems a little different. That sort of cruelty, if you will, seems a little different than alligators eat other creatures because that feeds them. That actually kind of maintains the ecological cycle. There's kind of a circle of life, if you will, that is not such a big deal. But cannibalism and abandoning young, that seems far more cruel. Why does that seem more cruel to us?
Well, because I think, as parents, we would do anything we could for the benefit of our children, right? There's that unconditional love that we have. And I think it's very easy to anthropomorphize the love that we have as parents to the animal kingdom and assume that same type of love actually exists. I think animals instinctually care for their young, but I don't think there's the same measure of love that they would have for their offspring.
So let's take a look at this cruelty. How does that square with a good God? What are some of the ways we look at that, or how do we wrestle with that issue?
Well, when you understand what the basis for animals abandoning young or animals cannibalizing their young, and recognize that it actually promotes the overall survivability of the species, you can begin to see some reasons why God would allow it. So, for example, if an animal has offspring and there's several offspring, but the resources in the environment are not sufficient for all of those offspring to survive, then cannibalizing or abandoning some of the young actually promotes the survivability of others, of the other offspring, which actually ensures the survivability of the species. Or there was a recent study with comb jellies, and it was discovered that these comb jellies are highly adept at occupying habitats that are beyond their natural normal environment. And they're able to do this, particularly when the food resources are actually diminishing, by undergoing this very rapid reproductive process where towards the end of the season, when the food resources are being depleted, they devote enormous amount of resources for reproduction, knowing that none of the larvae are actually going to survive.
Hmm.
But what they'll then do is, as the food resources diminish, they actually will consume the larvae, consume the offspring, and this allows them to survive much longer into the season and actually occupy niches within that ecosystem, ensuring the survivability. And so while it seems cruel to us, there is actually a rationale that actually is elegant to some degree as to why these creatures are doing that. And so
Yeah,
this gives us a reason why God might create them that way.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to be callous, but it seems like there's an aspect of this that, you could ask, well, why don't they produce more, or why do they produce so many offspring? But it seems like there's a that sort of cycle, if you will, provides a buffer for a more broad range of circumstances where, the environment's abundant, you can have multiple offspring that will be beneficial, but even if it's small, it still gives the organisms a way to compensate. It even seems kind of like that with the comb jelly. It's kind of like saving for a rainy day, if you will.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly right because organisms can't know what the environment is going to be like. The environment is highly variable, and so the best strategy is to actually have as many offspring as possible. And if the environment, as you're pointing out, can handle it, then that represents success. But if the environment can't handle it, then the best thing you can do to ensure survivability is either abandon young or to actually consume some of those young, you know, uh, as a food source, which ensures again the survivability of the species.
Well, and there's even an aspect of that that just shows how special humans are, because while that seems like I don't know how common it is in the animal world, but it certainly functions that way in the animal world. For humans to do that, that's just horrific. And so it's like, it seems like even the fact that it exists in the animal world and it's horrific in humans shows that there's a distinctness or a uniqueness about humanity.
Yes, and again, we react negatively to that for two reasons. One is, again, we have this unconditional love for our children, but on top of that, we also bear God's image, whereas the animals don't. And that's a very important distinction biblically, is that what is true for human beings doesn't necessarily apply to animals. And our danger is that we tend to project human qualities on animals when in fact they don't really possess them. And this ends up making us respond emotionally to what we perceive to be brutality in nature, when in many times, if it wasn't for these kinds of designs in the animal world, life wouldn't be possible.
I think your comment about looking at what does the Bible actually say is important, that we are kind of projecting on there. But one of the things that I initially found surprising is when you look at the Bible describes a world where God actually uses suffering. I mean, even in the creation process. Kind of illustrate some of those or flesh some of those out for us.
Yeah, and your point is really important because it's very important that we don't view God as the God that's a philosophical God, but the God that's a biblical God. And one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm. And here you see God being essentially being described as responsible for animal death and for predatory and carnivorous activity. And he's actually praised for that. And so, from a biblical perspective, the animal death, the pain, and the suffering in the animal world is part of the God's good creation, and that God is to be praised for that. And of course, that leads to a lot of questions about, why would that be viewed as part of the good creation? But it's clear from Scripture that this is the world that God made, and that God views this as being very good. And so maybe we have a distorted understanding of what is good and evil, uh, and we need to try to do our best to align our understanding with Scripture's understanding.
Well, thank you very much, Fuzz. I appreciate your comments. The problem of evil is far bigger than we're going to address today, but we've been able to illuminate at least one place where things that we think are cruel may actually not be evil in the way we think about it. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Fuzz's blog on this topic. It's called "Is Cruelty in Nature Really Evil?" Often what we find is things that appear cruel exhibit intricate design on further inspection. And his blog will help you understand that and be able to use that in a way to counter this argument that you often hear when you're engaging with skeptics.